Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel's back again with a new episode of Emancipations. I'm here today with Angela Harutyunyan, who's coming at us from Germany. And we are here to introduce to you all the thought of a lesser known Marxist aesthetic thinker, sort of art historian, art theorist, Marxist theorist by the name of Mikhail Lifshits. Lifshits is a very, very fascinating figure. And I actually was introduced to his work by listening to a lecture that you gave on his thought. And Angela and I met in the American University of Beirut a couple of years ago. And I was very struck by your interest in socialist realism. We have actually just done a huge study group with Emancipations podcast on Frederick Jameson's The Political Unconscious. And I've been doing a lot of work into socialist realism, looking at Lukács's work. And of course, Lifshits and Lukács were comrades in the 1930s. First of all, welcome to our program. Thank you for being here, Angela. Can you tell us a little bit about what first drew you to Mikhail Lifshits' work, what you found penetrating or insightful in it?
First of all, thank you, Daniel, for inviting me to this podcast, and I'll be happy to share some thoughts on Lifshits without actually. I don't consider myself a Lifshits specialist per se, though I've written a couple of things. I actually want to start with how you characterized him, and then I go into addressing your question. You mentioned that he's a art theorist, philosopher, art historian, and I think that's quite exemplary. This characterization, because in Lifshits you have a unique, almost like classical unity of art historical practice, methodological approach to art in relation to or as part of social totality and philosophy of art. So there's a unity of these three, let's say, domains that have been separated in the modern and postmodern compartmentalization of disciplinary categories. So what drove me to Lifshits? Actually, sometimes around, I think, 2010, 11, in Yerevan, with several friends and colleagues of mine, we started thinking seriously through Stalinism and what Stalinism was as a historical experience and as historical form, right? Because we were confronted with a couple of decades of post-Soviet oblivion, that any invocation of the Soviet past, quoting Robert Meister from another context, is an invocation of a history or evil that is past, and the past itself is evil, right? Although what we started noticing is that this disavowal or denunciation of the Soviet historical experience was precisely that was coming out of an identification of the Soviet with Stalinism, while Stalinism continued its kind of lingering, declining afterlife in not only in social institutions and forms of life, but also forms of culture. So we established an institute, the Johannesian Institute for Research in the Humanities, with a few friends and colleagues, to try to think through Soviet Armenian modernity. And this is what drove us to a historical critical investigation of Stalinism, of intellectual trends, but also entire bodies of work that had been erased by Stalinism in the 1930s and yet were very formative for Soviet Armenian culture. And in this context, we started asking whether within the Soviet Orthodoxy itself, there were propositions, there were aesthetic propositions and political propositions within the Orthodoxy, not counter the Soviet Orthodoxy, that were contra-Stalinist. And especially the work of art historian Vartan Azatian has been very formative for rediscovering for the Soviet Armenian context the character and the figure of Lifshits. I think he's working on a book that is not complete. It's called The Art History of the Ideal, where he's developing a theory, a historical theory that the so-called Western and Eastern Soviet and Western European art histories share common grounding in German idealism. And he looks at the work of Lifshits on the one side and Alpatov in the Soviet context, and Panofsky, Gombrich in the Western context. So it's from these conversations that that the idea or that the interest to look at historical aesthetic propositions that were part of the orthodoxy at counter
Yeah.
Stalinism started interesting us.
Fabulous. Yes. I think it's very compelling to ask the question how Lifshitz broke from Stalinist orthodoxy, which we can get to later.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps we might um, begin now by introducing a few seminal sort of propositions or sort of conceptual points that Lifshitz puts onto the table. The first, of course, is that he wrote this book, I think, called Karl Marx's Philosophy of Art.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the one that he's most well known for. And what he's trying to sort of derive is sort of what is most novel in Marx's, what is most singular regarding Marx's theory of aesthetics and art. And of course, the realism debate, as far as I can tell, hadn't fully matured. And it's very interesting. I wanted to ask you to maybe say something about this. One of the things we've examined in our studies of Lukács and of other debates in socialist realism is the position that was discovered post facto of Marx and Engels' own view on what's called reactionary realism. Balzac is most exemplary, but there's other realist authors whereby the letters express the view that realism, um, irrespective of the political worldview of the author, still provides an insight for revolutionary consciousness that could be utilized by the proletariat, that can be utilized for Marxist theory, that can be applied, et cetera, et cetera. And that really seems to have upended the presuppositions of the Soviet Marxist milieu. Can
Mm-hmm.
you help us sort of contextualize that discovery, when it occurred, and how it changed the intellectual itinerary and sort of agenda of Soviet Marxism?
Um, Actually, when I think when Lifshitz published the book Marx and Engels on Art and Literature in Russian in 1932, as far as I know, the Engels's letters on realism were not published yet. Although the institute where he worked with Lukács, the Marx and Engels Institute, had pioneered the publication of the political and economic manuscripts. So there was already kind of a initial Soviet discovery, right, of young Marx that Lifshitz and both Lifshitz and Lukács referred to in the Soviet 30s as on the one hand, like as a means to kind of escape the orthodox philosophical debates on what constitutes consciousness, what constitutes reality, that could be a trap, right, in many ways, in the context of intensifying Stalinist repressions. So young Marx, but also Hegel provided them a gateway to speak about art and aesthetics and literature without dealing with, let's say, like philosophy proper, if you wish. And Lifshitz confesses that in one of his later writings, the autobiography of ideas, that also this discovery of young Marx helped them to posit a counter conception in a sense of realism that would be that would avoid that would be actually counter to the prevailing positivism. relying on facts, right? That it is the individual fact or the isolated fact that somehow results directly and mechanically um, has an imprint in consciousness that itself forms certain representations. So precisely this sort of like, if we, this positivism upon which both vulgar sociologism relied in its Stalinist variant, but also before that in the realism of Russian factographers, right, that were already defeated by Stalinism, but against which Lifshits also spoke up, that he developed, along with Lukács, of course, kind of a conception of realism that was derived from, on the one hand, from the Hegelian conception of aesthetics as a sensuous, suprasensuous embodiment of truth. So one of the pillars of realism is the Hegelian truth. And then Lenin's theory of reflection, that the mind is not a mechanical reflection of reality, that there has to be some sort of reflectibility in reality itself, if you're a true materialist, for the mind to respond to it. But it's also dynamic and transformative activity, an activity transformative of reality itself. And finally, yes, Engels's letters on realism that has if I were to kind of summarize, even risking schematism, would be this conception that realism ultimately triumphs, right, despite and in spite of reified forms, calcifying stereotypes, etc., etc. That Lifshits developed, let's say, a conception of realism. So for him, realism is not a specific method of representation. It's not confined, right, to being a specific method of representation. Neither it is a historical phenomenon confined to a period. But it's a active mode of acquisition of knowledge, right, about the world, a critical acquisition of knowledge about the world, and its truthful and adequate form of representation. So what realism, in a sense, reveals, again, is not kind of a mechanical, positivist mirroring, right,
Right.
of reality by consciousness, but grasping from a specific standpoint the contradictions of reality
Yeah.
and the clash between reality and ideality that is formative for Lifshits
Yeah.
of the realism's aesthetic program. So
Yeah.
of course this also went counter the vulgar conceptions of within socialist realist aesthetics, right? Of kind of photographic or of mind as a kind of a photographic
Hmm.
machine, but also the Stalinist triumph or Stalinist conception that ultimately consciousness is synchronizable with the relations of production, right? With
Yeah.
the social world, with the material conditions of production and the relations of production.
And there's a revolutionary kernel in this theory that situates Lifshitz in a very interesting way regarding his own theory of alienation, which of
Mhm,
course you had already mentioned the 1844 manuscripts. But one of the points that Lifshitz insists upon, I think, throughout his oeuvre, is the proposition, in fact, that communist activity is about the sort of concrete break from systems of alienation. And so I want to actually examine how that actually is thought by Lifshitz in a very. But you had just mentioned this notion of the ideal,
mhm,
and this is one of the most important um, concepts in Lifshitz. There is a very helpful essay that he wrote on the figure Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who was actually, for folks that are familiar with Friedrich Nietzsche, Winckelmann is one of the figures that Nietzsche is trying to contend with and debate, regarding how we relate to ancient Greece and ancient Greek aesthetics. And as far as I can sort of summarize, and I would invite you to maybe summarize more in more detail here, part of what Winkelmann's conception is that ancient Greek aesthetics situates a sort of ideal of the contemplative, not so much this Dionysian break from form or action and dynamism and so on, but actually that the ideal of Greek art is found in this repose, in this kind of what is the concept? Ataraxia, this kind of right. And this becomes a huge source of debate. And I think that Lifshits seems to actually argue that from Winkelmann's perspective, what we can actually derive is a historical conception of how a class Weltanschauung, a class worldview of the bourgeoisie, because Winkelmann dies a few decades before the French Revolution, and he is seen as a figure who speaks to the constitutive basis of the bourgeois class worldview and their relationship to the ideal itself. So the first thing to note, and I think this is a powerful thesis, is that classes have a sort of general orientation to an ideal. Yeah. And therefore, the Marxist proposition of history as the sort of saga of class struggles also must actually situate how classes relate to a collective ideal. Yeah? So perhaps you could introduce this concept, because he then historicizes a shift in the ideal when the bourgeoisie actually takes power, and the way that this relationship to the sensuousness basis of the ideal undergoes a transformation. And perhaps you might introduce the ideal for Lifshits for us. I find it so deeply fascinating. A lot of, just as a side point before you introduce this notion of Weltanschauung, one of the things that like sort of post-structuralist philosophy has done, I think, to Marxist thought, is that it has made the very construct of the worldview a kind of taboo, or a kind of well, to people now think that it's kind of essentialist. So I myself, like, for example, if you read Lucien Goldman's incredible work, The Hidden God, no, the whole analysis hinges on the presupposition that there is something like a class worldview in history. I think that Lukács actually maintains a similar position. So that's a side point, but maybe you could introduce this concept of the ideal and give us the historical basis of it as well.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a very, I mean, I could start from the 1930s Lifshitz and then go to his discussion of the ideal, perhaps in Ilyenkov, in Evald Ilyenkov, a fellow philosopher of a younger generation from the 60s, to whose work Lifshitz actually formulated a response. And in the 30s, actually, throughout the Soviet 30s, as he was actually putting together Marx's and Engels's writings on art, arguing that even though Marx and Engels never wrote, right, a philosophy of art, because that would be not Marxian to do, a Marxian thing to do, one can discern a systematic philosophy of art if one looks at the fragments of their writings. So there is a systematic treatment of art and aesthetics that brings Marx as close as possible to Hegel. Because when one deals with art and aesthetics, one is always, even even if one is a consistent materialist, has to deal with the domain of ideality, with the ideal. And of course, Lifshitz begins, and he situates this within Marxian philosophy of art, begins with a Hegelian conception of aesthetics as a sphere of the sensuous and the suprasensuous. Sinnlich unsinnlich, right? A sphere where the spirit, the suprasensuous spirit, is embodied. So it is from this coupling, right, of the sensuous and the suprasensuous as the realm of aesthetics, that Lifshitz grounds his notion of Hegelian notion of ideality, but situates it within the Marxian, within early Marx, with Marxian conception of labor, right, as man's sensuous engagement with the world, through man's productive activity of transforming nature, of transforming matter in a historical process. And Lifshitz finds that in early Marx, the communist horizon, the horizon of emancipation of labor, runs through the pathway of aesthetics. When labor is liberated from crude need, from its subservience to alienation, to alienation as a social form. Of course, he doesn't use commodity fetishism yet. That's not a category. When labor is alienated, the de-alienation of labor, the emancipation of labor from crude necessity, from producing the social form of alienation, it's a pathway that runs through aesthetics. The aesthetic sensibilities, again, that about developing a conception of beauty through sensuous engagement, disinterested engagement with form, right, opens up a sphere wherein, again, the alienation of labor and the achievement of communism somehow become identical. So it is through this notion of ideality, right, that Lifshitz works from, and what he emphasizes in his compilation of Marx and Engels on art and literature is a specific notion that Marx works upon, but also it's ultimately a Winckelmannian notion of aesthetic ideality. But in Marx, aesthetic ideality is situated not in some sort of the needs of the suprasensual spirit, but there is a materialist explanation of aesthetic ideality and its historical, transhistorical character, right? And Lifshitz develops a reading of Marx's famous passages from the introduction to the Critique of Political Economy on Greek antiquity, that there is an unevenness between material conditions of Greek society and the ideality of its art, right? So Lifshitz emphasizes that this unevenness between material conditions and the ideality is not due to some sort of there is no mystical or transcendental explanation. But the unevenness between Greek art and the elementary forms of economic conditions that, of course, also relied on slave labor, right, is because precisely the elementary conditions of Greek economy allowed for some sort of a balance where the fetishizing character, fetishizing quality, or fetishism-inducing quality of exchange value hadn't become a social dominance, and it hadn't clouded consciousness. And there was a relative measure, and measure is very important. It's a Winckelmannian concept that Lifshitz revitalizes, right? Aesthetic ideal is about measure. It's finding a measure between what Winckelmann conceived as noble simplicity and calm grandeur, right? Where agonistic and antagonistic human suffering or joy can be expressed in form that is balanced and is grounded in measure. So Lifshitz found that there is a measure in Greek economy, and the rudimentary conditions of the division of labor that are not complex allowed for the existence of a relatively favorable conditions for small producers to interact with the consumers of their product without, again, being subsumed under commodity form, right? So this non-synchronicity between ideality and between elementary economic conditions or rudimentary economic conditions of Greek society precisely created or gave birth, right, to artistic forms that were ultimately geared towards human measure, towards human proportions, rather than towards the transcendental divine, right? And how the artists re-articulated the mythological conceptions of the world in artistic form precisely became the ground of the Greek ideality to provide also a transhistorical dimension that could be reactualized in different historical circumstances. Greek economy can never return, right? As a good Marxist, and Lifshits has a complex but nevertheless orthodox Marxist progressive conception of historical development. One can never return to the historical conditions of the past, to the economic conditions of the past. And yet the transcendental character or transhistorical character of Greek antiquity, rooted in the historical conditions of the ancient Greece, is precisely because it combined a political promise of democracy with the ethical ideal of human good, with the aesthetic incarnation of grounded in beauty, right? And in a sense, Lifshitz saw the Soviet Union of the 30s as a path towards, a final reception, let's say, of Winkelmann's aesthetic ideal of Greek antiquity, and he conceived his project of almost like single-handedly constructing Soviet antiquity, the scholarship on Soviet antiquity, as a battle to salvage the legacy of antiquity from its bad or Nazi appropriations. That if you're appropriating antiquity as simply a style, right, that can be resuscitated without its aesthetic and ethical content, then you are ultimately on the route to fascism, or this is what fascism does. And he saw the Soviet Union as the only possible incarnation of the truth and beauty that Greek antiquity embodied in a way.
Yeah,
Maybe we
it's
can come to Ilyenkov later because I think it's a
sure.
bit too much. It's too
No,
packed.
no, no. No, no, no. It's not too much. It's really powerful because socialist realism is a kind of classicism that's
Mhm.
in line with the historical revitalization of this egalitarian ideal of art. And that constitutes a kind of victory of the proletariat in history. Realism does. And I actually wanted to invite you maybe to say more about Lifshitz's conception of idealism. You had hinted at it before, but this notion that realism can be a kind of anti-fascist aesthetic, and that a certain conception of realism can uh, sort of galvanize a new relationship to Greek classicism. I mean, I am struck by, and Nietzsche's not a figure that he speaks about too much, although he is referenced here and there.
Mhm.
For example, he makes an argument that the reactionary humanism of Nietzsche can actually go to find a type of alliance with the bourgeois interest, precisely the notion of the Übermensch, the Superman, and so on. Um, he tries to show that aesthetic forms, and you could I would I'll have a secondary question regarding this debate that we see a lot within Soviet aesthetic theory regarding how he might uh, construe of reactionary aesthetic uh, forms. Most famously, this is expressed in Adorno's debate with Lukács regarding expressionism and some views that Lukács had, that expressionism was ultimately an aesthetic form kind of implicitly in line with bourgeois reaction, things of that nature. So that would be a secondary question. But could you elaborate a little bit more, perhaps, regarding Lifshits' theory of realism as a sort of rediscovery of classicism? How does that work?
Yeah. Yes, as I mentioned, right, for Lifshitz, realism is not confined to kind of a historical epoch, right, or a historical period. It's a mode, right, of of the articulation of truth that is achieved through artists' daily struggle with the reified, calcified social forms, but also with artistic forms. Right? I mean, as a good Hegelian, he conceived of realism as adequacy of form to the representation of content. And what was meant by content, right, is the multiplicity of social relations in their contradiction, the truth of life, that the artist represents or figurates from a standpoint in which these contradictions can be shown in their utmost tension, right? Rather than, I mean, this is why he was so critical of the so-called, proletarian art, prolet cult, that similar to Lukács, that conceived of culture as a kind of a representation of a specific class, right? Or a culture of a specific class in which consciousness kind of photographically, as I mentioned before, expresses certain class characteristics, right? So, and of course, I mean, Lifshitz's conception of realism here runs counter the relativizing notions that view realism as anything that reflects reality. So,
Can I ask a
Mhm.
clarifying question there?
Yes.
Just a quick clarification. So, on the one hand, you haven't mentioned yet this theory of the Weltanschauung, but it is interesting, as you just noted, that they are rejecting vulgar prolecult,
Mhm.
and that's important because I think that the stereotype would be that they're not, but they are. But they're still affirming that something like a historical logic of class worldview can be located, can be analyzed, and can
Mhm.
be historicized. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely, and I think that is correct. So I guess why there is a bourgeois Weltanschauung, right? Because the bourgeoisie is the dominant class, and in capitalist relations of production, and basically he derives it from the Marxian conception that the dominant culture, the ruling culture, is the culture of the ruling classes. And Weltanschauung is precisely, I think, he uses in an orthodox Marxist sense of almost like false consciousness, right? That there is a Weltanschauung that presents or represents the real relations of production, the real social relations in an inverted form. Whether there is a proletarian Weltanschauung in Lifshitz, it's questionable, I would say. He doesn't use the word Weltanschauung. For him, the proletarian quest, I guess you could say even contra Weltanschauung, is a quest for realism. Perhaps one could claim that realism is that which breaks proletarian realism, which is not the prolet cult realism, is that which breaks from the inverted consciousness of the real relations of production within the bourgeois, from within the bourgeois Weltanschauung, right? How do we conceive, right, of this question of proletarian realism without the prolet cult characteristics of consciousness reflecting a certain class position? How do we reconcile, right, these two things? I guess for Lifshits, the proletarian proletarian realism is not something that is a given or that is achieved, but something that can be crystallized or is sedimented through historical process or through historical ideality of calcifying or bringing together, not so much calcifying, but bringing together all those instances, right, where realism is at stake. And realism, again, as a certain expression of democratic dreams and wishes of liberation of the oppressed. For instance, he saw in ancient Russian art an articulation or a mode of realism, right, in icon painting, that reflects, again, the society's struggle or the society's wish, dream, for a political and ethical emancipation in aesthetic form. So for Lifshitz, I think it's very important to mention that, again, realism is not a given, but it's achieved in the process of the active and reproductive activity of the human mind, of man's engagement with the world, with a not as a contemplative reflection of that world, but something that shows the truth about the actual conditions of being. And realism is something that is also articulated through the key medium for Lifshitz, which is images. Right? In Russian, there is a word художественный образ. The closest translation would be artistic images. But image, obraz in Russian has a more kind of encompassing meaning, that image as representation, you could say, in that the English version applies. This means that somehow figurative images have their own reality, right? And they are not illustrative of truth that is extraneous to them, but they're active. It is through the images that the artist actively reworks the objective material world visible to the eye, and in the process of discovering truth in the reality's sensory forms.
I think what you said regarding proletarian worldview hits at the heart of where Lifshitz and Lukács diverge from Stalinism in its positivistic dialectical conception of class. And I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that as socialists, we have an ethical duty, frankly, to reject this notion that we would ever conceive of the working class as in possession of a coherent or harmonious Weltanschauung to itself.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, I think because this is the heart of dialectics, in fact, to refuse such a conception, but also the implication of saying that we know historically has profound political ramifications regarding the self-consciousness of the class, but also I think that when you go down that road, it's almost impossible to think liberation once you've gone down that road. So how can the proletariat be an active force for the overcoming of alienation becomes the question. If we were to affirm I think the right word would be sort of like a transitive theory of consciousness, where that whole dialectic of the for itself and the in itself, you don't really need that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really need the negation of the negation anymore, right? I mean, so it makes sense if in the grand political sweep of history, Stalin had already said that dictatorship of the proletariat was achieved. Well, yeah, then the proletariat now runs society. No questions asked. It's deeply problematic, right? But nonetheless, still, I would want to ask you, um, like, do you find compelling? And I think that a lot of critics have seen Lifshits perhaps as an idealist himself, and we see this a lot in Lukács studies as well, where people will chastise Lukács for affirming that something like de-reified consciousness is possible. So you see, there becomes a debate in postmodern, post-structuralist philosophy with Marxist philosophy on this matter regarding the proposition that something like de-alienated consciousness, or a consciousness that would somehow shrug off reification, should that even be on our agenda, right? And then, this gives rise to people making the argument, well, no, alienation is kind of constitutive. We should not. So it creates an interesting debate. And then we then get into the debate regarding conservatism of aesthetic forms, which I want to broach with you. But I want to invite you to maybe say a few things more about class and the understanding of Stalinism, how Lifshitz maybe is, and how practically did he survive, given that he is offering an imminent criticism of Stalinist aesthetics, dialectics. Hey, I mean, he part of what made him a renegade, I imagine, is that he was centering Hegel. And if you know anything about the Soviet period, a lot of people were outlawed because of their celebration of Hegel, even Ernst Bloch. Could you say a little bit more about this, perhaps?
Yes, I think we have to turn to the very turbulent years of the mid to late 30s to historicize Lifshitz's Hegelianism, but also, yeah, to also answer the question, right? How did he survive? And I think, Stalinism had a very contradictory relationship to Hegelianism and Hegel himself. Of course, in 1938, the very notorious textbook of Stalinism is published. It's called The Short Course, The History of the Bolshevik Party, where the article on dialectical materialism is authored by Stalin himself. He couldn't trust the historians, although he went through several rounds of editing of the entire book. That was, of course, a Stalinized representation of the party history, where he appears as Lenin's right-hand man throughout the revolution. But what is very interesting about this article on dialectical materialism is that Stalin embraces all the laws of dialectic, but somehow there is one important dialectical that is missing, which is the transformation of quantity to quality, which is ultimately is about the revolutionary break, right? This notorious short course basically posits a kind of a mechanistic, right, positivist development of conditions of production, synchronization of the relations of production with social consciousness, and so on and so forth. And it is, around this time in the late 30s that precisely Lifshitz starts delivering his lectures at the Institute of Philosophy, Literature, and History on Hegel's aesthetics. So these lectures were very, very popular. They were attended by young art historians, philosophers. He was also on the staff of the Tretyakov Gallery Museum, where he delivered lectures on Hegel's aesthetics that precisely kind of argued that to be true materialist, when you deal with art, you always have to turn to Hegel, whether you want it or not, because in objective idealism is where you have the most consistent treatment of the question of the ideal, as close as it comes to the materialist treatment of the ideal. So you always have to return to Hegel. And, again, as part of Stalinist contradictions, in the late 30s, you have the publications of Hegel's selected volumes. Right. So on the one hand, you have Hegelianism that is thrown at enemies of the nation or class enemies as an accusation that could land one in the Gulag or in other places. But on the other hand, it is within the context of Stalinism that you have Russian translations of Hegel's collected volumes. So how did Lifshits survive? Lifshits was attacked by the Soviet establishment for his Hegelianism. He didn't hold any positions after 1940. He was not part of the Soviet Institute of Philosophy anymore. He was surviving by writing short essays and journalistic articles. He was living in the basement of his friend's apartment. He actually went to the war during the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet Union, and he was also, I mean, very, very practically, right, engaged with the Soviet reality while being marginalized by it. And it was only, I think, in the 70s that he could defend his doctoral dissertation. He wasn't allowed to defend his dissertation until quite late. But nevertheless, it's very exemplary that he, despite what he saw, right, in Stalinism, that it's the incarnation of positivism, that this is the distorted embodiment of the communist ideal. Nevertheless, he kept on believing that the Soviet Union is the only really existing historical experience wherein the realization of communism is possible.
Yeah.
He didn't
Which,
give up on it, unlike, let's say, his younger comrade, Evald Ilyenkov from the 60s, who also worked in a similar vein with Lifshits and Lukács, but in the 60s with young Marx and Hegel, counter the Soviet orthodoxy, but also within kind of Soviet Orthodox Marxism as well. Ilyenkov gave up on the Soviet reality and he committed suicide in 1979, I believe, or 77.
thank you very much. This is, I mean, I I will provide a kind of link to some of the seminal texts that are translated into English for folks that are interested to actually really read Lifshits's work. Two follow-up questions. One, I think it's a good time to actually introduce Ilyenkov now, how their debates about the concept of the ideal worked, because I think, one of the interesting points of contrast between the two philosophers is that for Lifshitz, he is committed to something like Engels' dialectics of nature and the ideal, whereas I understand Ilyenkov is not, and so we can kind of give a gloss, give a sort of overview of this. I mean, it's a very complex debate, but I think I would invite you to sort of summarize it as best as possible, and also if you could introduce Ilyenkov to my listeners who maybe have heard this name, but maybe they haven't read his work. Where might be a good point to begin with Ilyenkov's work, and why do you, well, rather, what do you find very compelling about Ilyenkov's work? Because I mean, there has been, I think, a little renaissance of interest in his work. So who is Ilyenkov, and why don't you maybe like foreground this debate that they have? It's a very fascinating debate.
Yes, Daniel, I'll try to do my best in a few paragraphs or sentences to situate Ilyenkov as well. He's a representative of what you call the Soviet Shestidesiatniki, the 60s generation, that inspired by Khrushchev's thought, saw the possibility to revitalize some of the humanistic premises of Marxism. And Ilyenkov was a student at the Moscow University. in the department Lomonosov University and in the department of philosophy, where he actually published a pamphlet with his fellow students declaring that there is, I don't want to misrepresent him, but I think he declared that there is no such thing as kind of a separate, okay, I need to find the reference, so I will exclude it. But the basic premise of Ilyenkov's thinking from early days is that there is within Marx and within Marxism, there is a humanist tradition, or there is a deep-seated humanism that can be revitalized, and it could become become a reforming impetus for the positivistically inclined, let's say, oriented Soviet philosophy. Of course, Ilyenkov himself was marginalized, but he saw an affinity between, there was an affinity between, the Soviet 30s, the so-called the stream of 30s that Lifshits belonged to, and Ilyenkov, in terms of articulating kind of humanist foundations for Marxian thought. Right? This also runs counter, let's say, later to the post-structuralist and especially Althuserian readings of Marx, right? That argue that there are two Marxes. One is the Marx of the EPM, and then the more mature scientific Marx from the standpoint of Soviet creative Marxism. This is what Ilyenkov's and his comrades' circle is called. There is no distinction between the early Marx and later Marx, or the only there is no epistemological break, rather, but later Marx, this more scientific Marx, takes up the questions that he developed earlier in the EPM, especially the questions regarding alienation and the communist horizon of the overcoming of alienation, and transposes them on to more mature scientific articulation in Capital. Actually, where to start with Ilyenkov, right? There is a very interesting text that he wrote on the concept of the ideal in the 60s that later on became an encyclopedia article. This has been translated in a volume edited by Alex Levant and Vesa Oititsen. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. He also wrote a book that I think is also available in English translation on dialectical logic as opposed to formal logic. And since you asked about alienation, I think, Ilyenkov's conception of alienation was derived from both Hegel and Marx. That in Marx, it is in Marx that alienation, there is no distinction between the alienation of the spirit and alienation as a historical form, right? Because these are not distinct formations or distinct processes of externalization of the spirit. In Hegel, you have, on the one hand, the alienation is embedded in the very movement of the spirit itself, as its activity, let's call it, and alienation is also the way in which spirit alienates itself in human culture, right? As in a historical process. In Marx, alienation is only capitalist alienation. Right? There is no pre-existing alienation before the capitalist Entfremdung. So the Hegelian Vertauserung and Entfremdung become identical in Marx. So if alienation is a historical form, right, it's the capitalist alienation of the worker from labor, from product, from fellow men, and so on and so forth, that becomes a social form of domination, then it's also possible to overcome, right? So I'm quite aware of the recent debates regarding constitutive alienation And I think there's a very strange angle in them, because somehow, without wanting to essentialize alienation as as essentially human trait, it does so at the same time. Because if alienation is not simply is not possible to overcome, if there is constitutive and constitutive alienation, one is possible to overcome, the other is constitutive of subjectivity as such, then I think, yes, the Soviet Marxists would agree. But they're talking about the alienation that is induced by the inversion of commodity relations, where social relations that are supposed to be properly social relations are relations between commodities,
Mm-hmm.
seen as social relations.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps, yes, you could interrupt me while I develop my summary of the
Yeah.
of the concept of the ideal in Ilyenkov and Lifshits.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think this is something we will get to in a moment regarding what I find so interesting about the contemporary legacy of Lifshitz thought for modern philosophy, insofar as a lot of the presuppositions of post structuralism have um, conceived of a certain mandate regarding the aesthetics of diversity, and we'll get to that in a moment, and how maybe Lifshitz sort of problematizes a lot of the core ideas of post-structuralism. We can get to that in a moment. And of course there's this Lacanian problem of alienation, which really, when you combine the Lacanian view of constitutive alienation with the Marxist theory of reification, a lot of Marxist authors that I'm drawn to, that I'm compelled by, will point out that what gets missing is a materialist understanding of reification, whereby you almost psychologize reification, or you psychologize, unbeknownst to yourself, because that's not the intention of the Lacanians, whereby it becomes unclear, actually, whether the horizon of our activity, of our critique, is still on the side of something emancipatory, because it has now detethered itself from categories of labor, categories of production, categories of labor power. So those are valid debates to have, and I love those debates. Uh, but yes, now let us now pivot back. So there's this debate uh, between Lifshitz and Ilyenkov, and I feel that it's an interesting debate. And I feel that your work is really trying to sort of, and maybe this is something you're still developing as well, bring it to the fore. So maybe you could say something a little bit about the stakes of this debate between the concept of the communist ideal.
Mhm.
Speaking of post-structuralism as an interesting aside, it does remind me of Alain Badiou's notion of communist hypothesis. I do think that actually a great article could be written on Badiou and this whole debate too, because there is this conception in Badiou of what he calls idealism without idealism. Hmm? So there is a sort of necessity for communist philosophy to think the ideal. How are these two philosophers, Ilyenkov and Lifshitz, conceiving of this? Could you elaborate more?
Yes, that would have been a very interesting project to involve Badiou, especially that, well, Lifshitz himself is ultimately a Platonist in a way. And that's precisely what comes out in his very last work. Before he died in 1983, the book itself was published only posthumously. It's called Evald Ilyenkov and the Communist Ideal, or Evald Ilyenkov and the Communist Ideal. And actually, it's this is a kind of an untimely debate. Why? Because Lifshitz wrote his response to Ilyenkov's concept of the ideal in '83, 5 years after Ilyenkov's suicide. So Ilyenkov never got to respond to Lifshitz's commentary, and Lifshitz was very well aware that this work remains kind of, this conversation would remain ultimately incomplete. So what is Ilyenkov's conception of the ideal, right? That start from them. He kind of, in the dialectic of the ideal, the essay that I already mentioned, which has been translated and the readers can refer to it, Ilyenkov sets to clarify the stakes for developing a materialist conception of the ideal. Why, right, do historical materialists need a conception of the ideal? Well, first, the ideal, traditionally conceived as the domain of philosophical idealism, more than any other concept, can help to show the limitations of idealist philosophy itself. And then we cannot let, as materialists, as a consistent materialists, we cannot leave it to the positivists and empiricists to develop vulgar conceptions of the ideal as either inside the human brain or as endowed with objectivity outside of the human material world, historical world. But also when one deals with the concept of the ideal, it ultimately, what is at stake is highlighting Marx's own foundations in Hegelian thought, especially when it comes to the question of the ideal, right? This is something that also Lifshits and Ilyenkov share, or the project, Lifshits' project of the 30s and Ilyenkov's project of the 60s and 70s share. So for Ilyenkov departs from Hegel's conception of ideality as tied to the dialectic of the abstract and the concrete, of the self-actualization of the spirit, its objectification in human material culture, and its alienation, Vertauserung. So he says that in Hegel, ideality is a characteristic of the materially established, materialized, reified, objectified images of social human culture, which confront the individual possessing consciousness and will as a special supernatural objective reality. So in a way, spirit actualized in Hegel, this is Ilyenkov's reading, is precisely a mirror, right, through which the individual awakens to self-consciousness. The culture that we produce, it becomes that alien other that we are confronted with as we appropriate the world again in our in the process of individuals awakening to self-consciousness. But nevertheless, right, for Ilyenkov, Hegel's limitation is that he doesn't grant independent existence to the material world, and the true objectivity of the ideal is not to be sought in the domain of ideality itself, or idea, the suprasensuous idea, but in the historical and material world of human praxis. And Ilyenkov's stress is actually is on the constitution of the ideal in humans' historical engagement with the material world through activity as a transformative process, right? So it is in Marx's analysis of commodity, in its spectral objectivity, gespenstige Gegenständigkeit, right? And in its fetishistic character, that one can point at the true objectivity of the ideal in its historical form. And of course, actually, I read it, the first statement, right, that I found, maybe I'm wrong, but it was Lifshits in the early 30s that already saw a kind of a structural analogy between aesthetics and commodity form. Because what they share is the specific structure of the sensuous and the suprasensuous. And I think Ilyenkov already develops, right, this understanding that commodities share with aesthetics the structure of the sensuous and the suprasensuous. And if we go to the very structure of commodity fetishism, we can undo the crude and non-dialectical separation between the ideal that exists in the human head and the material that exists outside of it. Because the simple commodity is a product of labor, yet it is that which acquires power over man. Its ideality, its ideal form, is a result of human historical praxis. So then ideality arises out of the inversion of human social relations. The commodities speak, right? We are all speaking commodities, and constitute social relations, while social relations mediated by commodities are, so to speak, dead. And the ideal form for Ilyenkov is objective because it constitutes a definite social relations between people that assumes a form external to them, that has power over them. Of course, this is the reading of Marx's subchapter on fetishism of the commodities. So he says, if I'm allowed, I'd like to quote, I think it's quite interesting. He says, ideality is a kind of a stamp impressed on the substance of nature by social human life activity, a form of the functioning of the physical thing in the process of social human life activity. So all the things involved in the social process acquire a new form of existence that is not included in their physical nature and differs from it completely, their ideal form. So it's a relationship of representation, right? One commodity representing the body of another commodity. And for Ilyenkov, this ideal form is shared by the entire symbolic universe of human activity. Language, television towers, tools of production, art, statues, etc., etc. So if we kind of summarize this conception of the concept of the ideal, so the ideal emerges as a result of human social labor that is historical. It acquires autonomous sensuous suprasensuous existence over man through language, social institutions, works of art, what Marx called the inorganic body of man. It is objective, and its objectivity is grounded in the human, social human, and not in nature. So Lifshits precisely starts by rebooking Ilyenkov's notion of ideality, saying that there is a contradiction between his two statements, that the ideal has an objective universal existence and that it has collective existence and is embodied in the manifestations of labor and culture. So there is a contradiction here between, for Lifshits, objective universality versus collective social being. If I were to give a kind of a spoiler, right? For Lifshits, there are good ideals and bad ideals. You cannot put in the same pot artworks and commodity form, right? Money and artworks do not belong to the same kind of structural ideality. So Lifshits upholds that objectivity, universal objectivity, or objective universality rather, is grounded in nature. So this is where he takes, right, his kind of ontology of nature from Engels, but also it's quite Aristotelian in its articulation. That ideality is in nature, and it's natural forms that leave their imprint on man. And he actually declares, like rather crudely almost, if there is no ideality in nature, how in this sense ideality arises in human societies. He says that it exists in material being and in consciousness, ideality, both in society and in nature, or else it exists nowhere. So he's looking at ideality as a kind of a movement, right, through which the ideal strives towards identity with its concept and becomes a condition for truth. So this is profoundly Hegelian notion. And the ideal is the ghost of the true being of the real, since it haunts the real with ideality. Again, we can also see some reverberations with Adorno and Adorno's own Hegelianism, that real things are kind of shadows of ideals. For Lifshits, right, society, let's say, is identical with its concept only with arrival of the communist society. And until then, this ideality will haunt the society that has yet to be identical with its concept. So things that exist are imperfect, but there is a movement, right, of the existing things of the real towards the ideal. So Lifshitz says that there's a positive dialectic towards higher forms of truth, good, and beauty that is embedded in the purposefulness of nature that extends from nature to the social world. But he says, it's quite interesting, he says the ideal is in the world, but passes it not through a front gate. It's not some kind of a happy journey, right, towards realization. And the love of scorpions heralds Romeo and Juliet. So there is a kind of a connection between there's ideality even in the very bad and distorted both natural and cultural forms. And there's a connection between the love of Scorpios and a higher form of art, such as Romeo of Juliet. So he's saying that Ilyenkov's mistake is that he doesn't make a distinction, or for Ilyenkov, idee and ideal are identical. And he asks, right, if the ideal exists in nature and is revealed through the movement of the real towards higher forms, how can money be a form of the ideal? Because is money a form that is identical with its concept? And Lifshits' answer is no. Money is ideal rather than ideal, such as idols, ideology, without the ideal, since it clouds the real social relations of production. Like chairs, right, developing ideas in their wooden heads. And in the world of commodities, for Lifshits, the relationship between man and nature is perverse and antagonistic, and yet ideality strives towards harmonizing this relationship. And man's labor here is the mediating activity which reveals the objective qualities embedded in nature. That's Lifshits, and develops ideality in labor and in art. Because this is not a translated work, I'd like to quote, if it's possible, my translation for the audience to kind of ground Lifshits in his actual writing. He says the form of the pot is not alien to the material that it is made of. The form of the statue is somehow contained in the piece of marble or ideal or in the potentia. And the sculptor only throws away the excess through a long and yet deep-seated metaphor. It is good or ideal that the sculptor reveals in a piece of marble the natural forms capable of conveying forms of other objects. It is bad and unideal when a piece of gold out of which toilets will be made at some point in time turns into a fetish, an objective power that becomes a monstrous mediating link, allowing an elder to subject the love of a maiden to his power. So, I mean, long story short, I think there are political repercussions as well to these different conceptions of the ideal and the stakes for the communist ideal, right? Aesthetic ideals as a gateway for the communist ideal. So in Ilyenkov, Lifshits saw a kind of a dead end, a historical dead end, that commodification cannot be politically overcome. There is no dialectical conception of the overcoming of the commodity relations as historically embodied also in the Soviet experiment itself. Whereas for Lifshits, right, even if in a very distorted form, the Soviet historical experiment or experience remained the only real existing historical project that promised the realization of the aesthetic ideal as a communist ideal, right, as the ideal of universal emancipation. And I think there's also kind of a generational difference between them, because Lifshits was kind of fought in the very smithy of the Bolshevik Revolution, right, in the Soviet 20s, and went through the Stalinist 30s. And his generation, despite everything, they upheld a kind of historical optimism towards the Soviet project. Whereas for Ilyenkov, from the perspective of the 60s generation that was post-Stalinist, they didn't go through this transformative project of the Soviet 20s and 30s. So he saw that there is no horizon of emancipation either in the West, in the capitalist conditions of reification, or in the communist East, where you have another form of reification that is covered up by the ideology of proletarian party coming to power, right? This was a long.
No, it's really, thank you so much. I'm so excited to re-listen to everything you just articulated for us, because it's something that, of course, I'm in the process of understanding myself and researching and reading and absorbing. Couple thoughts. The first is the sort of natural ontology in which the ideal is understood as a purposive. Would you qualify that as a teleological understanding? I think that it would be.
Yes.
And what practical effects does that have on the discipline of art criticism is one question that I have. You've written about this. Famously, Lifshits declares a lot of modern art as Philistine, ugly.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, there was a exhibit on the Soviet 60s which was making fun of this notion that all we can valorize is the soup can.
Mhm.
And so, where does a classic realist form go? And sort of there's this, where does beauty go? Where does now on at first blush, the art critic may see Lifshitz as some kind of idealist dreamer in a sort of
Mhm.
caught in some, I don't know, anachronistic nostalgia, maybe.
Mhm.
But of course, I think that what we've tried to articulate here is that there's actually perhaps a way to introduce his thought in the context of contemporary art criticism in a way that might actually be more productive. And maybe you could say provide a point of contrast or tension to some of the predominant ways that art criticism thinks about uh, political liberation, thinks about commodity fetishism, um, etc. Uh, so what are I guess I want to pivot now to more of the practical implications of Lifshitz
Mhm.
theory for the world of art criticism, which I think is a world that you live in to some extent. Um, you can introduce that however you wish. Perhaps you can introduce it vis-a-vis his criticism of postmodern art, but also perhaps introduce this point that you make, which I hinted at before, which is that why? Well, first of all, we haven't actually talked about this. Why do you think that Lifshitz is known as a conservative? I mean, I think my own view is personally it's propaganda. Right? It's Cold War propaganda. It's anti-communist propaganda. But nonetheless, maybe there is a grain of truth to that. But we would have to sort of reverse the way that conservative is being operationalized or being applied, right? So let's now move to sort of the practical implications of his wider critique for, because you want to say that it's not just the world of art theory and art history and art criticism that he's rubbing up against. It's also philosophy. It's also critical theory. It's bigger than that in a way, right? So maybe introduce sort of these debates, and if you could share with us as a side point, what do you make of this debate that Adorno and Lukács have, in their famous back and forth essays on realism
Mhm.
and expressionism? Many people are familiar with that debate. Famously, Lukács will say, like, well, when we look at an artist like James Joyce, um, there are some questions regarding the liberatory potential of certain aesthetic forms. And so socialist realism becomes perceived as conservative in the sense that it's sort of constraining the experimental avant-garde. Um, how do you situate all of those debates, and how might we? Because I always feel, Angela, that we sort of need to reposition the basis of those debates, because there seems to be a lot of amnesia, maybe
Mhm.
regarding where they originate from, but also perhaps amnesia regarding the fact that the way that we are told these debates happen are also like victim of Cold War propaganda, if that makes sense.
I think it does. I mean, definitely Lifshits. I mean, I wouldn't call him a conservative, but I would call him a classicist rather, because for him there is, what is wrong with modernism is precisely that it posits itself as a rupture from tradition, right? For Lifshitz, there is a historical continuity. If one looks at the development of culture not from the standpoint simply of cultural forms, but from the standpoint of the mode of production, then there is one has to deal with the question of contemporary culture as one that is grounded in both in a kind of a dialectic of rupture and continuity, right? And I think that's important for Lifshitz. And why he's, I think, taken as a conservative is precisely because, I mean, nobody really likes socialist realism. It's like bad art, right? From the perspective of the of avant-garde, of our sympathies with the avant-garde and its aleatory and fragmented form and formal innovation, but also from the perspective of avant-garde's kind of historical defeat. The sympathies of contemporary critical discourse are with the avant-garde and the post-avant-garde and neo-avant-gardes and their reverberations. But I think, I mean, of course, I'm not advocating that we can kind of revive Lifshitz in all his aspects, and he's very much grounded. His work is very, very much grounded in Soviet historical world that doesn't exist anymore. And I think what is left of that world are distorted shadows or ruins that are reactualized today for regressive purposes, right? For Russia's neo-imperial project of domination, or even by, let's say, the decolonial critique of the Soviet that completely misses the point, right? The Soviet Union as a colonizing empire and so on. It becomes, I'm sorry to be a bit crude, but I think this critique becomes the other side of the coin of the Putinist appropriation of the Soviet and its identification of the Soviet experience as of Stalinism as a Russian imperial project, wherein it leaves out all the emancipatory, right, historical experience that was on the ground in the Soviet 20s and further on even, of various nations and communities, ethnic communities, articulating a modern political project and becoming modern subjects, right? It gives in too easily to this identification of that was a Stalinist identification precisely of the Soviet Union with Stalinism and ultimately with the Russian Empire. So I think what Lifshitz nevertheless brings us is both a methodological but also a political standpoint from which we can, what I consider kind of repoliticize both art history and art criticism, not as sort of autonomous disciplines that reflect and critically, reflect upon art's total subsumption, right? Give away too much about art's relation to to commodities, but still posit the question of unevenness not only within capitalism itself, but also unevenness that capitalism itself produces, and looking at unevenness, uneven development as a site of possible struggles. So let's say, if in the 20s, 30s, if Trotsky or Bloch very differently were writing on this question of non-synchronicity or unevenness, combined and uneven development, and the question was like how pre-modern forms of production, social form, come to constitute anachronistic strata within the capitalist relations of production, but that anachronism itself is produced, right, by capitalism. Today, I mean, we can ask a similar question, but from our historical conjuncture, the question is how the Soviet project of attempt, at least, of non-capitalist or socialist modernity that saw itself as post-capitalist in late capitalism becomes anachronistic. What do we do, right, with its active, declining yet active remnants? And I think, Lifshits' reworking of art's ideality in relation to uneven development is one of the key concepts that can be brought back to art history, art criticism, and to re-entangle our mode of writing, thinking, producing art, and doing exhibitions in the in social totality, in relations of production, but also asking the question of realism today, right? Not that we need to kind of again resuscitate realism as form, which would be a formalist, ultimately vulgar formalism, but to posit the question how to represent or figurate, which is also a Jamesonian question, right? This vast world of the capitalist sublime. What are the
Yeah.
forms that are adequate
Yeah.
to the figuration of our world? What is
Yeah.
how do we incarnate the truth about our being in the world that appears as increasingly fragmented with accelerated catastrophes just piling upon one another? How do we grasp something that is how do we grasp and represent its dialectical core, right, kernel?
Can you introduce the concept of the end of art and this
Mhm.
uh, idea? Because I think, perhaps it's something that you write about in the sense that it maybe dovetails with this notion of the end of ideologies, the end of history, etc., etc. Maybe for people that are not like students of art criticism, you might introduce these debates, because I think that's another way that Lifshitz can speak to the contemporary discourse on art criticism. So first of all, what actually is this debate regarding end of art? What is this about?
Of course, it takes up from the famous Hegelian, right, thesis that art is a thing of the past. Of course, there will be artists, there will be art critics, but art as the necessary mode of the actualization of the spirit and it's as truth has been bypassed or has been surpassed by in Hegel by religion and then ultimately by philosophy, right? And this kind of continuous Hegelian end of art, this recurring end of art that has been resuscitated so much throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, it has taken many forms, right? From the Socialist ready-made to Joseph Kossuth to Arthur Danto. So I've been seen many ends, but paraphrasing Hal Foster, maybe this funeral is for the wrong corpse, as that would be probably Lifshitz's position. That the only sublation of art as art, that is possible and that is desirable, would be the sublation, or it would be the realization of art as the communist ideal, with the liberation of labor from its subservience to capital, right? So Lifshitz does overtly address the end of the art thesis, and in Hegel, in his 1930s, late 30s lectures on Hegel's aesthetics, and he says that, of course, the Hegelian end of art is we need to refuse it, we need to refute it. Hegel is right. We abide to the Hegelian conception of aesthetics as the, as the entwinement of the sensuous and the suprasensuous. We are with Hegel regarding the Greeks, but the Hegelian end of art posits a kind of a historical teleology or a teleology of the spirit, wherein the ultimate emancipation is seen in the realization of the spirit in the Prussian state, right? And and in philosophy and modern philosophy, for Lifshitz, precisely Marx's intervention is that the answer the development of human culture, to the development unfolding of history, is not to be sought in the development or unfolding of the spirit, but in the practical realization of the proletariat, right? So the end of art has not an aesthetic end, right? Aesthetics doesn't end, but rather it is not realized, and its realization is only possible through with the proletariat's emancipation from crude necessity and from labor as a value generating activity. Does this
Thank
make
you.
sense?
It makes a good deal of sense. I feel one question would be to introduce ideology here. One of the debates that's happening now in the world of art criticism and art discourse is, of course, this question about the ideological politicization of contemporary artists.
Mhm.
Um, what might a Lifshitzian view be on that? Because I mean, it's very paradoxical in my view, right? Which is there's not a kind of transitive relationship between the subjective ideological orientation of an artist
Mhm.
and the emancipatory content of their art. Like, if that were true, um, we would have a quite limited capacity for finding emancipatory kernels in art. Like, David
Mhm.
Lynch is a New Age spiritualist who knows nothing about communism, but still, nonetheless, we can find in his films something regarding a thesis on alienation. We can
Mhm.
find Marxiological content there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I feel that there's been a portrayal of ideology in art that's quite vulgar in a certain
Mhm.
way. Yeah. Um, how do you parse those debates out? And this kind of goes back to my prior question about the way that people sometimes think about socialist art criticism as forcing a homogeneity of ideology, right? Um, I don't think that it does. I don't think you think that it does. But maybe you could address people that do think that it does, so to speak. Uh, does that make sense at all? What I'm saying here? Uh,
Yes, absolutely. So I guess yes, of course it does. I mean, the question of ideology is very complex, right? And of course, like if we, I mean, Lifshitz was truthful to Lenin's articulation of ideology, that ideology is not only false consciousness. There is also an ideology that is capable of breaking from false consciousness, right? That their ideas that are capable are of precisely destabilizing or or reversing, right, the camera obscura function of ideologies Weltanschauung. And of course, for Lifshitz, ideology cannot, the artwork's ideology, right, let's call it, cannot be reduced to the individual artist's head or the individual artist's consciousness. Because precisely consciousness is not something like 1 + 1 + 1. and But the collective consciousness is something much more complex, right? Dialectically entwining subject and object relations or subject's entanglement, a reworking of the objective world out of which consciousness arises, again, not as a mirror, but always with some kind of a delay, hiccups, or in incongruence, in a sense. But yes, I would actually like come back to your question about socialist realism and whether it's kind of a boring, monotonous, monolithic style. I mean, I think the way in which socialist realism as style had been realized, right? It became, of course, it became dogmatic, doctrinarian, and so on and so forth. But I actually, whatever it is, and we might dislike it, um, it it arises out of an impetus to articulate a truly popular culture. I mean, it might have failed. It did fail, but popular not in a sense of like folkloric, ethno-folkloric, but in a sense rooted within a coupling of class and identity, national ethnic identity and class, rather than ethnic national identity and class. This is something that actually today is seeing there's some kind of a, I think, bastardized revival, right? That there are ethno-folkloric forms coming back under the aegis of sort of like decolonial aesthetics. But decolonial aesthetic produces this kind of conception of the popular art rather than popular art rooted in class. It produces the folk as a new spectacle that can counter, reified forms of Euro American and so on modernisms and the avant-garde. But I think this is something that we can also take from Lifshits, and I think not just Lifshits, but there are other sorts of articulations. Let's say in Latin America, debates in the 60s and 70s, right? What constitutes popular art that is not simply ethno-folkloric? And precisely this insistence that the popular needs to be grounded in class. And when we talk about indigeneity, or we talk about local struggles, we're ultimately not simply dealing with cultural expressions of identities, but we are dealing with the question of proletarianization, of dispossession of land, right? Of this repetition of primitive accumulation. And you cannot disentangle the cultural expressions, monumentalize them as having a possibility to kind of confront, let's say, the reified forms of contemporary art. There are also forms of contemporary art, right, that are being revoked as spectacular aesthetics. I hope this was not kind of too cryptic, because there's been a growing kind of popularity of spectacularized indigenous forms in various biennials and
Do you
art.
think
Yeah.
that the theorist can once again derive in a Brechtian way a kind of pedagogy of aesthetics that would be liberatory in our time? Are you hopeful, or not hopeful, but optimistic, like Lifshitz would be, that something like aesthetics still uh, can facilitate de-alienation? Because I think that there's a certain postmodern cynicism regarding that proposition, right? A kind of
Mm.
cynicism which would say, well, we've somehow moved beyond this, or sort of like, you see my point. They would sort of cut down that as either unrealistic or bound up. I mean, and here the post-political enters into the post-art in
Yeah.
a certain curious way, because to affirm that would also necessitate that one is also affirming something like collective politics is possible. So both affirmations have to be true. How would you uh, speak regarding de-alienation? Are you optimistic about this? And is there also like a, I don't know if pedagogical is the right concept to think it, but like, in Brecht you do have uh, a thought out conception by which um, forms of de-reification or de-alienation in the experience of the consumption of the art itself kind of functions. Here I'm talking about the estrangement effect in particular in his didactic plays, for example. Do you think that this kind of orientation to aesthetics today is possible?
I think, I mean, first of all, I don't think, for Lifshitz, aesthetics was a facilitator of of communism. Maybe I could reformulate it and say that, well, emancipation or communism can only be achieved through the proletariat struggle, right?
Yeah.
So there is no, but its path, it's akin to the path that is charted by aesthetics, yeah, of the sensuous and suprasensuous entanglement of the sensuous and the suprasensuous.
When you say akin, you mean it's kind of analogous. It's sort of
It's analogous, yes.
analogous. Yeah.
It's analogous, and ultimately
It's
the
not,
realization.
in other words, he's not saying that it's like an aestheticization of politics.
Exactly,
He's not
yes.
saying that. Okay.
She's not saying that, and that aesthetics is not an outmoded, bygone project, but rather that it hasn't been realized. It hasn't achieved its social realization, right? It's proper social realization, or we call it, let's say, sublation, right? Is only from the standpoint of is only possible from the standpoint of emancipation of labor. So, I mean, I don't believe that. I mean, today, right? We're in a much more, let's say, tragic historical conjuncture than even Lifshits in the 80s, where we have late fascism without any communist alternative to it. We have accelerating, escalating genocidal violence, ethnic cleansing, the sense that we cannot do anything about it, though it's been unfolding live. The genocide has been unfolding live for the last almost 2 years. And there is a sense of, like impeding collapse that cannot be stopped, right? Accelerated collapse. Like, where do we look for emancipatory politics, let alone aesthetics? But I mean, I think it's, I mean, despite and in spite of the disintegrating social historical world, I think we need to insist on precisely those spaces where critical pedagogy becomes possible, and to rearticulate questions of art in relation to political and social struggles, right? Ultimately, the struggle is not about becoming a martyr. No, it's about insisting on living, loving, and creating. And these are the forms of expression of living and loving and creating, right? Can be found both historical and contemporary artistic forms and practices. So I guess, I mean, I think the question is like, how do we, right, bridge today between the actual struggles in the context of the unfolding genocide, the mode of political organization that is, even if we don't see this sort of political organization taking the main stage today in state politics, but there is global mobilization, right, of students, of even dock workers that sometimes refuse shipping of weapons and so on. How do we organize these struggles in a political form, and what kind of cultural expressions can be found? I think these are the questions that we need to ask today, rather than looking for answers in reified institutional forms of the art world.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
one sort of final question.
Mhm.
Good and bad art, and this notion of the ugliness
Mhm.
of Lifshitz's thesis. Uh, of course, I think maybe the general intuition of most non-trained, non-educated people when they are looking at postmodern art would probably kind of agree with Lifshitz regarding his assessment there
Mhm.
of its Philistine basis. It's kind of grounded in a kind of relativism or something like that. How do you fall on this notion of that, well, of his text there in particular, on the ugliness of modern art? Can you Would you be willing to sort of defend it, or do you think that well, I guess it's also like a polemic, right? So
Mhm. Yeah.
it's not meant to be taken so literally. Um and then I also, so that's one question. Then I think my other question was, where do you fall on these debates about the contemporary you had already mentioned some. But could you say a little bit more about the contemporary politicization of art today? Do you see it as an evacuation of politics? There's a very interesting concept by Anton Jager, which is called hyperpolitics.
Mhm.
Um, how do you see contemporary politicization of art? Um, and so to comment on that as you wish, but also this notion of ugliness and good and bad art. I've always wondered how one categorizes aesthetic taste and things of that nature. How do you approach those questions?
Um, okay, so basically, I think Lifshitz, if I remember it correctly, it's been a while since I read the Crisis Безобразия, the crisis of ugliness, is that the ugly form, right, the commodity form, which is actually the repetition of the commodity form, is the adequate presentation of an ugly content, which is the reified conditions of capitalist societies. So actually, what I remember in that essay, "Why Am I Not a Modernist?" right, which is part of this three essay that he published in 1968, he even says it's not the artist's fault. It's not, he's not blaming the individual artists and their distorted consciousness for producing forms that he ultimately his ultimate verdict, right, is that these are ugly forms. But there is some kind of a deep philosophical and historical problematic in the rearticulation of these forms that lead towards a kind of a negativity, right, that is ultimately mystical. That what the neo avant-garde shares, if I may, is a tendency towards nihilism and mysticism that is in itself, in its very source, ultimately, or either in its source or in its result, I don't know how to posit this, ultimately is fascistic, right? But also it's about the fetishization of novelty, right? And I think, where do I stand in this in Lifshitz's description of the crisis of ugliness? That, well, the ugliness precisely is a representation of a society in crisis, right? In that sense, it's kind of adequate to the society from which it comes. Even the most distorted form for Lifshitz contains certain kind of a truth about distortions themselves. And I think here he's also like deeply Hegelian. And I think this polemic, right? You mentioned that it is a polemic, yes, and it is a polemic, and it is rather crude. And actually, it's this work that in the 60s, 70s earned Lifshitz the reputation of an arch conservative amongst, the intelligentsia, amongst the artists who were starting to embrace Western modernism and contemporary art contemporaneous to them on the other side of the curtain. And it's interesting that there are several polemics like that, and they all come from the philosophical, let's say, tradition, or from the philosophical circles, wherein artists have kind of moved beyond this criticism, and they were saying that Lifshitz and others, they do not understand art and artistic processes. They're speaking from a bird's eye view as kind of philosophers, right? Where am I going with this? So I think what's interesting, right, in this work is that he refuses to look at modernism either as a particular style or a compilation of group of artists, but a kind of a Weltanschauung, if we may,
Right.
of capitalist relations
Yeah.
of production. And I'm not sharing his, crude criticism of modern art. I teach modernism and avant-garde, and
Sure.
I'm very sympathetic to those projects. But from a again, like a from a perspective of an art historian, art theorist, I do stand for Lifshits's or beyond Lifshits's questioning, right, of the contemporaneity of contemporary forms. How contemporary are they? And what does this contemporaneity promises us? Because I think there is just too much valorization of a break
I see.
with what existed before, what came before, that doesn't allow us also to think about our present historically.
And that goes back to this thesis, which you, I think, identify as one of his most important contributions, of the unevenness. So
Yeah.
if we accept the unevenness, then we no longer have this theory of sort of like strong breaks. And
Mhm.
yeah, because, I think you're right that post-structuralism, perhaps surprisingly, does sort of rely on a strong theory of break and rupture in a certain way. So it almost lacks a proper theory of unevenness in its own conception of historicism, perhaps. I feel like Frederick Jameson tries to address this issue. Although there's a poverty of reference in Jameson to Lifshitz, even his book on antinomies of realism, one would have liked to have seen uh, a confrontation with Lifshitz, but it's not there. Um, but that's okay. I think,
And forgive Jameson.
we can forgive him. He's made many other contributions, so we'll forgive him on this level. Angela, what else have you been working on these days, if you don't mind telling our audience maybe about your current research, what you are up to?
Yes, I've been trying to navigate the thorny terrain of the German Stadträson. I've been teaching mostly, and in Germany you teach 4 courses per semester, new seminars, all new seminars, and it's been quite enriching. But at the same time, it's really hard to focus on research. But I have an invitation, and I agreed to it. I'll be curating the Sharjah Biennial, and I decided precisely to take up some of the academic questions and historical questions I've been asking in my research and in my seminars, the question of uneven development
Mm,
to the biennial form, to see how far I can push the limits, right, of this global transnational art event by asking the question of unevenness. And I've been, yes, working with a group of art historians in Armenia on compiling an anthology of 20th century art criticism published in periodicals in Armenia.
hmm hmm
But yes, I mean, you read the draft. The version of article on Lifshitz will be coming out hopefully in the Nordic Journal of Aesthetics, and I'll be happy to share with you when it's out.
Yeah, it's a wonderful piece because I think it helps compile almost the entirety of um, works on Lifshitz as well as his own works, both in Russian mostly, but some in English. We do have a fair amount translated. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, listen, I just want to thank you for a very dynamic and very rich conversation into this topic. I benefited from it immensely. I'm very, I think it's I think that if anything, I want comrades to understand that one cannot ignore Mikhail Lifshitz when thinking about Marxist philosophy, philosophy of art, aesthetics. And hopefully, we're kind of making a case
Mhm.
to take his work more seriously. Um, and you've really helped me do that. So thank you for that. And we wish you the best. And thanks so much for coming on. We'd love to bring you on in the future.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for inviting me and for giving me a chance to bring different fragments of my work on Lifshitz together somehow. I hope these fragments didn't stay as fragments in the interview and somehow they cohere for the
Oh, no,
listeners. Yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, friends and comrades. Until next time, all the best.